The sun hung low in the sky, casting elongated shadows across the parking lot of a bustling suburban grocery store. It was one of those late afternoons where the air felt heavy with humidity, and people hurried through their errands to escape the oppressive heat as quickly as possible. Cars zipped in and out of parking spaces while shopping carts clattered against curbs. Amidst this ordinary chaos stood Marcus Thompson, leaning casually against his car, a sleek silver sedan that gleamed under the fading sunlight. Marcus was an unassuming figure at first glance. Dressed in khakis and a crisp white button-up shirt, he exuded quiet confidence without demanding attention. His dark skin glistened slightly from the day's warmth, and his eyes carried a thoughtful depth that hinted at years spent observing human behavior. At 34, Marcus had earned success not by chance, but through hard work, determination, and intellect. He held a Ph.D. in economics and worked as a professor at a prestigious university nearby. But today, none of that mattered. Today, he was just another shopper trying to get home before rush-hour traffic swallowed him whole. As he loaded groceries into his trunk, Marcus noticed someone approaching him, a middle-aged woman with fiery red hair pulled back into a tight bun. She wore oversized sunglasses perched on her nose despite the waning light, paired with a floral sundress that seemed more suited for a garden party than a run to the supermarket. Her name, though unknown to Marcus at the moment, was Karen Whitmore, a local real estate agent known around town for her sharp tongue and even sharper opinions about, well, everything. Karen marched toward Marcus with purpose, her heels clicking against the pavement like a ticking clock counting down to something inevitable, something unpleasant. As she drew closer, Marcus instinctively straightened up, sensing trouble brewing beneath her forced smile. "Excuse me," Karen began, her voice clipped and condescending. "Are you aware that your car is parked over 2 spaces?" Marcus blinked, momentarily caught off guard by both the accusation and its tone. He glanced behind him at his perfectly centered vehicle, then back at Karen. "I'm sorry," he replied, keeping his tone calm and measured. "My car is clearly within the lines." Karen tilted her head, squinting theatrically as if inspecting his claim. Well, it looks awfully close to the line there," she said, pointing vaguely toward the passenger side of the car. "You should really be more careful. Some of us have larger vehicles to maneuver." Marcus raised an eyebrow, resisting the urge to laugh at how absurdly petty this interaction already felt. "Ma'am, I assure you, my car isn't blocking anyone. If you're having trouble finding a spot, maybe you could try circling again." Her lips pursed into a thin line, and her cheeks flushed pink, not entirely from embarrassment, but rather indignation. How dare this man dismiss her so easily? Didn't he know who she was? Or perhaps, more importantly, didn't he see what she saw when she looked at him? "Listen," Karen snapped, stepping closer until she was practically toe-to-toe with Marcus. "I don't think you understand. This kind of carelessness reflects poorly on people like you." People like him. Marcus frowned, his patience beginning to fray. "What exactly do you mean by people like me?" Karen hesitated for only a fraction of a second before doubling down. "You know what I mean? People who can't follow simple rules because they lack basic intelligence." The words hit Marcus like a slap across the face, not because they stung emotionally, but because they revealed so much about the person standing before him. Racism often disguised itself in subtler forms these days, cloaked in microaggressions or coded language, but Karen wasn't interested in subtlety. She wanted confrontation. And now, here they were. For a moment, Marcus considered walking away. After all, engaging further would only give her what she craved, attention and validation. But something inside him stirred, a mix of curiosity, frustration, and maybe even amusement. This woman clearly believed herself superior, based solely on stereotypes, and Marcus couldn't help but wonder how far she'd take her delusions. "Well," Marcus said slowly, crossing his arms over his chest. "If we're going to talk about intelligence, perhaps we should put it to the test." Karen blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Marcus continued, his voice steady and laced with challenge, "that if you're so confident in your intellectual superiority, then let's settle this once and for all. An IQ test. Right here, right now." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Karen's face, but pride quickly smothered it. She squared her shoulders and smirked. "Fine. You're on." And just like that, the stage was set for an encounter neither of them would soon forget. Over the next hour, the parking lot transformed into an impromptu arena of sorts. Spectators began gathering. First a handful of curious shoppers drawn by the escalating argument, then others who joined purely out of morbid fascination. Phones were pulled out, videos recorded, and whispers rippled through the crowd as word spread of the bizarre showdown unfolding before them. Karen, emboldened by the growing audience, strutted around like a peacock displaying its feathers. She barked orders at bystanders to clear a space near a picnic table tucked along the edge of the lot, declaring it her testing ground. Meanwhile, Marcus remained composed, watching her antics with detached amusement. He knew full well that this spectacle wouldn't end well for her, but he decided to play along. For now. To everyone's surprise, including Marcus's, Karen actually produced a printed copy of an IQ test from her oversized designer handbag. Apparently, she kept such materials on hand for moments like this, or perhaps simply to feel intellectually prepared at all times. Either way, she slapped the papers onto the table with dramatic flair and gestured for Marcus to sit. "Let's see if you're as smart as you claim," Karen sneered, taking the seat opposite him. "Or if you're just another stereotype waiting to be exposed." Ignoring her jab, Marcus picked up the test and scanned the instructions. It was a standard format, a mix of logic puzzles, math problems, vocabulary questions, and pattern recognition. Exercises, nothing particularly groundbreaking, but certainly challenging enough to weed out those lacking critical thinking skills. "Ready?" Karen asked, tapping her pen impatiently against the table. "As ready as I'll ever be," Marcus replied with a shrug, flipping to the first page. They worked in silence for several minutes, the only sounds being the scratch of pens on paper and the distant hum of traffic. Occasionally, Karen glanced up to gauge Marcus's progress, her expression shifting between smug satisfaction and creeping unease. Though she refused to admit it aloud, she hadn't anticipated encountering someone who might actually match, or surpass, her own abilities. By the time they reached the halfway point, Karen's confidence had visibly waned. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and she chewed nervously on the cap of her pen. Each question seemed harder than the last, and no matter how many times she reread the instructions, the answers eluded her grasp. On the other hand, Marcus appeared completely unfazed. His movements were deliberate yet fluid, his pen gliding effortlessly across the page, as if solving each problem were second nature. Finally, after nearly 45 minutes, Marcus leaned back in his chair and set down his pen. "Done," he announced simply. Karen's jaw dropped. "Already, but there's still 10 minutes left," he shrugged. "Guess I'm just efficient." Flustered, Karen scrambled to finish the remaining questions, her handwriting becoming increasingly illegible as panic set in. When the timer finally buzzed, signaling the end of the test, she collapsed back into her chair, exhausted and defeated. "Well?" Marcus prompted, raising an eyebrow. "Who's grading?" For a brief moment, Karen considered refusing to participate. Further, surely there was some loophole she could exploit to avoid facing the truth, but the weight of the crowd's expectant stares bore down on her, leaving no room for retreat. With trembling hands, she handed over her completed test and watched as Marcus exchanged it for his own. As they swapped papers, Karen couldn't shake the sinking feeling in her gut. Whatever the results, she knew deep down that this wasn't just about proving intellectual dominance anymore. This was about confronting the biases and prejudices she'd clung to for far too long, and realizing, perhaps too late, that they wouldn't protect her from reality. And so, with bated breath, the two adversaries began scoring each other's tests, unaware of the revelations awaiting them and the lessons they would ultimately learn from this strange, unforgettable encounter. The picnic table, now littered with crumpled napkins and empty soda cans left behind by earlier patrons, became the unlikely stage for a reckoning. Marcus and Karen sat across from each other, their pens poised like dueling weapons as they began, grading each other's tests. The crowd that had gathered earlier remained eerily silent, their collective curiosity palpable in the humid air. Phones were still recording, but no one dared to interrupt what had become an almost ceremonial event. Karen glanced nervously at Marcus's test paper, her lips pursed tightly. She couldn't help but notice how neat and precise his handwriting was, each answer written with deliberate care, as though he'd approached the exercise not just to win, but to prove something deeper. Her own answers, on the other hand, looked rushed and chaotic, her penmanship deteriorating toward the end as panic set in. For the first time since initiating this absurd challenge, Karen felt a twinge of doubt creep into her mind. "All right," Marcus said calmly, breaking the tense silence. "Let's start scoring." He picked up Karen's test and began reviewing it methodically, ticking off correct answers and circling mistakes. Karen watched him intently, trying to gauge his expression for any sign of mockery or triumph. But Marcus's face remained neutral, betraying nothing beyond concentration. This only made Karen more anxious. She wanted him to gloat, to give her some emotional ammunition to fight back against whatever humiliation lay ahead. Meanwhile, Karen reluctantly turned her attention to Marcus's test. As she scanned through his responses, her stomach sank further with every passing question. Not only were his answers consistently correct, but many of them included additional notes, explanations, alternative solutions, even diagrams were applicable. It was clear that Marcus hadn't merely guessed his way through the test. He'd dissected it, analyzed it, and conquered it with surgical precision. This isn't fair," Karen muttered under her breath, her voice tinged with frustration. Marcus looked up briefly, arching an eyebrow. "What isn't fair? You're overthinking everything," Karen snapped, gesturing wildly at his test. "These aren't supposed to be essays. They're multiple-choice questions." Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Overthinking, or just applying logic? Seems like the instructions didn't specify how detailed my answers needed to be." Karen opened her mouth to retort, but quickly closed it again, realizing how weak her argument sounded. Instead, she focused all her energy on finding errors in his work, scrutinizing every line as though searching for a lifeline. But the harder she looked, the more flawless his answers appeared. By the time she finished scoring his test, there wasn't a single mistake to be found. "Well," Marcus prompted, setting down Karen's completed scorecard, "how did I do?" Karen hesitated, her pride warring with the undeniable evidence before her. Finally she mumbled, "You got a perfect score." A murmur rippled through the crowd, punctuated by a few scattered claps. Marcus nodded politely, accepting the praise without gloating. He then reached out for Karen's test, which she reluctantly handed over. His eyes skimmed over her answers, occasionally pausing to jot down marks in the margins. Unlike Karen, who had circled his mistakes with exaggerated flair, Marcus graded her work with clinical detachment, ensuring accuracy above all else. When he finally finished, Marcus leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Not bad," he said, evenly. "But you missed about 30% of the questions." Karen's face flushed crimson. 30%? That's not terrible." "It's average," Marcus corrected gently, "which, honestly, is better than most people manage on standardized IQ tests. But considering your confidence going into this..." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Karen bristled, her embarrassment morphing into defensiveness. Average is good enough, and besides, this doesn't prove anything. Just because you scored higher doesn't mean you're smarter than me. Marcus tilted his head, studying her carefully. Doesn't it, though? Isn't that why we're here, to settle who's smarter, based on your criteria? Karen faltered, unable to deny the truth of his words. She had been the one to demand this showdown, to insist that intelligence, and by extension worth, could be measured and ranked. Now, faced with the reality of her defeat, she scrambled to salvage whatever scraps of dignity she could. This is ridiculous, she huffed, standing abruptly and gathering her belongings. IQ tests are flawed anyway. They don't measure real-world skills or emotional intelligence. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Funny how you didn't mention that, when you were so eager to prove yourself superior. The crowd erupted into laughter, prompting Karen to spin around and glare at them. Oh, shut up! None of you know anything about me or him, she spat, pointing accusingly at Marcus. This whole thing is meaningless. With that, she stormed off, her heels clicking angrily against the pavement as she disappeared into the sea of parked cars. The onlookers slowly dispersed, some shaking their heads in amusement, while others whispered amongst themselves about the spectacle they'd just witnessed. Despite Karen's dramatic exit, Marcus lingered at the picnic table, staring thoughtfully at the stack of papers between them. While part of him felt vindicated, after all, he'd proven his point without resorting to cruelty, he couldn't shake the nagging sense that something larger was at play here. This confrontation hadn't just been about intelligence, it had exposed deeper issues rooted in prejudice, insecurity, and fear. As he packed up the materials, Marcus noticed a young woman lingering nearby. She looked to be in her mid-20s, wearing a bright yellow sundress and clutching a reusable shopping bag. Her curly brown hair framed a face that radiated both curiosity and apprehension. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" Marcus smiled faintly. "I'm fine. Why wouldn't I be?" "I don't know," she admitted. "It's just, though that was intense. What she said to you, the way she acted, it was wrong. I'm sorry you had to deal with that." Her sincerity caught Marcus off guard. In the heat of the moment, he hadn't stopped to consider how the encounter might affect those watching. To him, it had been a personal challenge, a chance to call out ignorance and arrogance in its tracks. But now, seeing the concern in this stranger's eyes, he realized that the stakes had been higher than he'd anticipated. "Thank you," Marcus replied warmly. "That means a lot. But honestly, I think she learned more from this than I did." The woman frowned. "Do you really believe that?" She seemed pretty upset. "Oh, absolutely," Marcus agreed. "And maybe that's a good thing. Sometimes discomfort is the first step toward growth. Whether she chooses to reflect on today's experience or doubles down on her biases is entirely up to her." The young woman nodded slowly, processing his words. "Still, it must have been hard to stay so calm if someone treated me like that." "It wasn't easy," Marcus admitted. "But anger doesn't solve anything. Besides, engaging with ignorance directly gives us a chance to dismantle it, to show that stereotypes don't define us." His response seemed to resonate with her, judging by the thoughtful look on her face. "You're really smart, aren't you? Like not just book smart, you've got wisdom too," Marcus chuckled softly. "I appreciate the compliment, but let's not forget, I'm just a guy who happened to ace an IQ test. Wisdom comes from listening, learning, and being open to change, something I hope Karen figures out eventually." They shared a brief smile before the young woman excused herself, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. As he walked back to his car, he reflected on the strange turn his afternoon had taken. What had started as a routine grocery run had spiraled into a public display of intellectual sparring and, ultimately, a lesson in humanity. Later that evening, as Marcus sat in his living room grading papers for his upcoming class, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from a friend who had seen videos of the parking lot incident circulating online. Apparently, the clip of Karen storming off in defeat had gone viral, sparking heated debates across social media platforms. Some commenters praised Marcus for handling the situation with grace and intelligence. Others criticized Karen for her blatant racism and misplaced arrogance. A few even questioned the validity of using an IQ test to measure someone's worth, a critique Marcus found particularly ironic given Karen's initial insistence on doing exactly that. But amid the noise, one comment stood out to Marcus. It read, "Sometimes the best way to combat ignorance is not by tearing people down, but by showing them a better path forward." Props to this guy for rising above. He stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling a surge of gratitude, not for the praise, but for the reminder that actions speak louder than words. Yes, Karen had challenged him to an IQ test, hoping to assert her superiority. But in the end, the true victory hadn't been about numbers or scores. It had been about demonstrating patience, empathy, and resilience in the face of prejudice. And perhaps, Marcus thought, as he turned off his phone and returned to his work, that was the most important lesson of all.